February 1945, Iwo Jima. In the center of the Pacific, an island covered in black sand and silence. The Japanese believed they had turned that piece of volcanic rock into an inviolable tomb. Deep tunnels, concrete bunkers, cross-firing ranges. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was confident that even without victory, he could inflict such a high price on the invader that fear would become a weapon. Japan did not expect to win. It hoped to make the enemy bleed until it hesitated. That confidence was about to evaporate. What emerged on the beach of Iwo Jima was not just a troop, but a cog. Heavy tanks, yes, but with something new attached to them. Something that didn't fire projectiles, but it breathed fire under pressure. Weapons that didn't need to aim, just get closer. And that, in the face of tunnels and courage, responded with a simple solution: incinerate the air. This is the report of a miscalculation. From an honor-based doctrine being consumed by 300 psi of liquid pressure, Japan dug deep to resist and discovered that hell could come on treadmills. And when the fire began to gush, even the ghosts retreated. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any map or report. In just 7 days, 8 American flamethrower tanks destroyed more than 300 fortified positions on Iwo Jima. Single-handedly, they caused nearly a third of the Japanese army's casualties on the island. It was not bombs, nor Marines. It was the compressed, liquid, merciless fire that made its way through tunnels designed to withstand hell. And when the heat pierced the steel and evaporated the air, the doctrine of honorable death found something more absolute. If you value story told with accuracy, respect, and evidence, please consider supporting this work with a like and your application. This helps us keep the memory alive, including the battles won with ideas, not just with weapons. Beneath the black sand of Iwo Jima, there was a city, excavated in silence, camouflaged by volcanic geography, built not to die with the first shot. When the U.S. Marines landed on the beach on February 19, 1945, they encountered no trenches or immediate gunfire. What they faced was absolute, almost ritual silence. The real battle was buried. Over the course of months, Japan turned Iwo Jima into an underground fortress. More than 11 miles of tunnels have been opened, connecting command posts, ammunition depots, field hospitals, dormitories and firing galleries tens of meters deep. Instead of resisting on the surface as on Saipan or Guadalcanal, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi devised a new defensive doctrine: disappear from the field of vision, force the enemy to come to the center of the labyrinth, and there charge, with blood, every meter gained. The island was divided into autonomous sectors, each with resources to fight in isolation, even after the breakdown of communication with the central command. There were 21,000 men there, well-armed, well-sheltered and indoctrinated, not to retreat or surrender. The mission was not to defend Iwo Jima. It was to make it too expensive to be copied in Okinawa or even in mainland Japan. Each pillbox was equipped with machine guns, light artillery, and cross-firing ranges. Some caves had steel doors salvaged from sunken ships. Others were protected by entry angles so close that the explosion of a shell could not penetrate. The island was mapped and sculpted as an organism, with channels, respiration, circulation. The plan was clear: stop America with stone, steel, and sacrifice. But there was one error, almost invisible, that would only reveal itself when the enemy used his least visible weapon: time. While Japan worked with soldiers and shovels, the United States worked with plants and schedules. The American war effort mobilized 17 million civilian workers. Every 24 hours, 28 warships, 240 bombers, 650 tanks, and thousands of spare parts rolled off the assembly lines. War, for the United States, was not a field of honor. It was a logistical equation. Kuribayashi calculated well the pain he could inflict, but it underestimated what America was capable of manufacturing by the hour. One example sums up the disparity. While Japan produced about 2,300 light tanks during the entire year of 1944, the United States produced more than 49,000 medium and heavy tanks in the same period, a difference of more than 20 times. And more important than quantity was adaptability. With each combat, American engineers updated what was needed. When the machine guns did not work against the caves, they created concentrated charges. When portable flamethrowers failed against steel doors, they adapted the system to M4 tanks. It was a war that responded in real time. If this scale of production already impresses you, write in the comments, absolute power. Kuribayashi was not a fanatic. He was a lucid strategist. Trained in Japan, graduated in Canada and the United States, he knew the enemy and knew he couldn't beat him at sea, in the air, or in factories. That's why he dug in. He bet on psychology, on moral resistance. He knew that Iwo Jima would fall, but he believed that it could delay the invasion of Japan by months, perhaps force the Americans to rethink the invasion strategy. And so he organized the defense as a self-sufficient system, with no front line, where each cave would become a last trench. The Japanese soldier would not back down, simply because there was nowhere to go. The hope was that the soil would swallow up the American advance. But what Kuribayashi didn't foresee was that the enemy would bring hell in the shape of a tank. As the tunnels deepened, Honolulu workshops developed the CBH-1, the experimental model of vehicular flamethrower, capable of launching pressurized fire more than 80 meters away, lasting 80 seconds per charge. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a morale depressurizing mechanism. Unlike traditional guns, which exploded, the CBH-1 involved. It suffocated. It burned with precision and continuity. For an entrenched army, the American weapon eliminated oxygen, shelter, and the sense of waiting. The shelter ceased to be protection. It became a thermal trap. During the first days of combat, the American troops faced exactly what Kuribayashi had promised. Slow advance, very high losses, invisibility of the enemy. But by adapting the flamethrowers to Sherman tanks and integrating them into mixed squadrons, the tide turned. Japanese doctrine based on passive resistance and the use of terrain did not provide for a weapon capable of penetrating through the entrances, following the path of the tunnels and incinerating everything with a single shot. It was the collapse of defensive geometry, and more than that, it was the collapse of a belief. While each Japanese bunker was treated as a bastion of honor, American tanks treated them as logistical points to be neutralized. There was no duel, no direct confrontation. It was an action of erasure. With each meter advanced, fewer soldiers appeared, not because they fled, but because they melted. The war was now not visible. It was thermal. On the 5th day of the invasion, American commanders noticed something new. Japanese soldiers began to avoid underground positions with a high concentration of smoke, even if they were fortified. It was the first sign that the doctrine was giving way. The Kuribayashi fortress was still intact in its structure, but it had begun to crumble from the inside. And what would happen when the architect of the resistance himself admitted that there was no longer any way to contain the industrial imagination of the enemy? This revelation is on record, and it will be the center of the next part. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi knew the enemy. A military observer in the United States in the 1930s, he had traveled through the American industrial interior and witnessed what many Japanese commanders ignored. Modern warfare would be decided by power plants, not uniforms. Still, even with this lucidity, he made a mistake that would seal the fate of Iwo Jima, not in its defensive architecture, but in the assumption of what kind of war would be fought. Kuribayashi predicted heavy artillery, constant shelling, and frontal assaults, and he prepared his island to withstand them all. Its caves had angled entrances, designed to deflect shockwaves. The casemates had double exits, to avoid total collapse in the event of a direct impact. Supplies were buried dozens of meters from the surface. The island was ready to withstand any visible attack, but Kuribayashi designed his defense against the past. What would come from the beaches of Iwo Jima was something no imperial plan had foreseen. Tanks that would breathe fire with surgical precision, supplied by a logistics chain that crossed oceans with clockwork accuracy. It wasn't a war of bravery, it was a war of design. Japan trained its soldiers to die in honor, but not to survive the 1,300-degree heat launched 80 meters by hydraulic jets. Japanese doctrine presupposed resistance to pain, not combustion. Their bunkers would resist grenades but not evaporation of the oxygen inside. Its tunnels diverted pumps, but did not prevent the spread of heat through compressed air. Kuribayashi's mistake wasn't technical, it was cultural. He underestimated how much the enemy was willing to invest in innovation in order not to die. While Japan treated each soldier as a spirit willing to sacrifice, the United States treated each casualty as an engineering failure. This difference in mentality is what turned ordinary tanks into absolute weapons. American war wasn't made to challenge honor. It was made to defeat systems. The vehicular flamethrowers were not a last-minute improvisation. They were the result of field tests, statistics compiled in previous combat, interviews with troops who had died while trying to enter bunkers on the island of Tinian. The weapon was built by Navy engineers in conjunction with civilian workmen, using standardized parts of the Sherman M4A3 tank. Its ammunition was based on napalm, mixed with dense gasoline, propelled by compressed air at 300 psi. The ignition system was electric, with a failure rate of less than 1.2%. The necessary pressure was generated by an internal reservoir that required 3 technicians to reload between shots. Each tank had the autonomy to launch a continuous 80 seconds of fire, enough to eliminate an entire system of tunnels without even having to enter them. None of this data was secret, but none of them were on the radar of Japanese doctrine. Kuribayashi did not ignore American industry for negligence. He was surpassed by it in speed, scope, and philosophy. The fortress of Iwo Jima was designed to stand up to the force, but what arrived was applied intelligence. The real collapse began when Japanese soldiers realized that their defensive strategies were becoming traps. Sealed doors, designed to resist grenades, prevented heat dissipation. Tunnels with no side exits concentrated toxic smoke. The places that were once safe became furnaces. The structure that promised protection began to accelerate death, and with that, morale, built on the promise of heroic resistance, began to fragment. When American reports indicated that 2 or 3 shots were enough to completely disable a fortified sector, the battle ceased to be a matter of courage and became a matter of time. The failure of the Japanese doctrine was, in essence, to underestimate the elasticity of the American doctrine. While Japan preached rigidity and sacrifice, the United States tested, failed, adjusted, and returned to the field with new solutions. The launch of the flamethrower tanks was one such adjustment, an element that irreversibly altered the tactical balance of the war. No doctrine prepared to die resisted the logic of being incinerated without warning. No map of resistance predicted that the enemy would not attack where expected, but would hurl fire in arcs, filling the voids, saturating the spaces, setting fire to silence. Kuribayashi, until his last days, maintained discipline, but in one of his reports intercepted and translated by American forces, one sentence was jotted down and sent directly to the Naval High Command in the Pacific. They don't win with force, they win with ideas. This admission, coming from the architect of Iwo Jima himself, summed up what Japanese strategists failed to understand. The enemy didn't just fight, he reinvented combat. And the weapon that would seal this ideological collapse had not even shown its full power yet. Because behind the scenes of the island, far from the front, a group of American engineers was finalizing an even more efficient prototype, a variation of the flamethrower with extended range, adjustable accuracy, and an accelerated reload system. The next shot would change not only the geography of the battle, it would change the very concept of shelter. And it is precisely with this new technical chapter that the next part will begin. Long before the first jet of fire touched the ground on Iwo Jima, the war was already won in the shadows of a forgotten workshop in Hawaii. At Schofield Barracks, a military outpost hidden between training camps and makeshift hangars, the project that would change the course of the war in the Pacific was born. There, far from the spotlight of the front, a group of naval engineers, civilian workers, and combat veterans met daily to solve a problem that the generals barely knew how to formulate: how to take a dug island like an anthill without burying 1,000 Marines at each advance. The answer didn't come from strategy books. It came from welding, grease, and technical reasoning. The CBH-1 prototype, an informal acronym for Composite Barrel Hawaii Model 1, was a makeshift hybrid between the hull of the M4A3 Sherman tank and an originally portable flamethrower system, now adapted to an armored, pressurized, internally control-driven structure. It was literally the industrialization of hell. The weapon was developed from surplus parts, repurposed engines, and modified cylinders from firefighting systems. The concept was refined by a group that history has almost forgotten: mechanics, boilermakers, and technicians from the CBS, Construction Battalion Shops, of the United States Navy, a technical corps parallel to the combat battalions, but with a role as decisive as any division of Marines. CBS was not a glorious unit. His men did not land under fire or appear in heroic photos, but their workshops functioned as small centers of tactical innovation. There, any report coming from the battlefield was immediately transformed into a prototype. With each report of a bunker that resisted the portable flamethrower, a new idea emerged for how to increase pressure, range, or fuel efficiency. At Schofield, 3 names began to circulate among those who knew. The first was that of Edward Meza, a mechanical engineer trained at the University of Chicago, who led the integration between the Sherman's engine and the flamethrower's hydraulic system. The second was that of Alton Red Greeley, a Texan boilermaker who perfected the piping cooling system to prevent accidental ignitions inside the tank. The third was Thomas Yamada, a Japanese-American veteran of the 442nd Regiment, who, after being wounded, had been transferred to technical services and began to act as a translator of Japanese manuals, providing valuable data on the underground defensive structures that his own family members had helped build decades earlier. Yamada was the first to suggest using rudimentary thermal sensors to identify underground air concentrations, an indirect hint of tunnels and bunkers. The process of assembling a CBH-1 took 72 hours and involved more than 20 technicians. Each tank was unique, adapted from the specific state of its chassis and the materials available. The flamethrower was powered by a dense mixture of gasoline, motor oil, and napalm, held under pressure by auxiliary tanks attached to manual valves. The ignition system, developed with the help of merchant marine engineers, used an electrical spark protected by a redundant circuit, an innovation that reduced the chances of failure during firing by 90%. The main pipe, informally called the Dragon's Throat, was forged from recycled pieces of naval plumbing and withstood temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees Celsius for up to 40 continuous seconds. The range under ideal conditions reached 90 meters. 3 times more than any portable weapon available at the time. The decision to send the first CBH-1s to Iwo Jima was not made by a general, but by a logistics officer. Commander Alfred Langston, in charge of cargo embarked at Pearl Harbor, included the tanks in an experimental batch, along with anti-aircraft artillery and tow tractors. He based his choice not on direct orders but on reports describing catastrophic losses in the landings on Saipan and Tinian, caused by subterranean pillboxes. If there is a weapon that turns shelter into a trap, it deserves a place on the ship, Langston wrote. This seemingly minor logistical decision turned out to be the turning point of the operation. The arrival of the flamethrower tanks on the front line caused surprise even among the Marines themselves. Many of them had never seen a CBH-1 in action. The first shots made on the beaches of the Green Sector created columns of fire more than 6 meters high, and sound similar to that of a jet plane taking off. The flames advanced through the entrances of the caves as if they had a will of their own. In a matter of seconds, what had previously required heavy artillery and frontal assault was now solved with a calculated shot. Operators were trained to calculate the jet's trajectory based on the slope of the terrain and the direction of the wind. It was, at the same time, science and terror. The CBH-1 tanks weren't just guns. They were statements. Declarations that the war now obeyed another logic. That victory no longer belonged to the bravest soldier, but to the most efficient system. That the hero of the day could be a Hawaiian worker who knew how to weld 2 pieces so as not to leak fuel under pressure. On the battlefield, the Japanese did not know the names of Meza, Greeley, or Yamada, but they knew the sound of fire, and each time he appeared, they knew that something other than courage would be needed to survive. In the following days, the CBH-1 tanks would become the center of a new combined tactic, but before that, one of them, number 431, would have its baptism of fire in a cave that no bomb had been able to break. And what happened there redefined what secure position meant in the Japanese military lexicon. This story begins with a map, a canyon, and a single word on the radio: light it. The first real mission of CBH-1 Sherman 431 began in the northern sector of Iwo Jima, in an area marked on the map only as Cave 8A. Reports from the first few days indicated that that position had withstood 6 artillery attacks, 3 infantry thrusts, and 2 direct launches from portable flamethrowers. No movement had been recorded on the enemy side, but the shots came out of there with mechanical precision. It was an isolated, silent, and for that very reason, lethal stronghold. The commander of Bravo Company authorized the use of the 431 with a simple order: advance until you hear the wall. The tank moved slowly over the black sand, flanked by 2 riflemen with rudimentary thermal detectors. The target was a small opening in the rock, almost invisible from a distance. When the CBH-1 moved into position, armament operator Sergeant Mason D. Wyatt adjusted the flamethrower tube based on relief and side wind. No shots had been fired so far, but it only took 5 seconds of ignition. The jet of fire entered through the crack and turned the interior of the cave into a high-pressure furnace. Later reports indicate that the internal temperature exceeded 800 degrees in less than 10 seconds. The sound, which until then had been that of the beach and the wind, was interrupted by muffled screams. It wasn't just death, it was underground panic. For the first time in the entire Pacific War, a carefully constructed Japanese position collapsed not by structural destruction, but by internal combustion. When the infantry advanced minutes later, they found what he described as a charred space where no living thing could breathe. The 8A casemate no longer existed, and along with it, the myth of the invulnerability of the underground collapsed. The impact of that first shot was not only tactical, it was symbolic. The Japanese, trained to resist with silence and restraint, responded with disorderly gunfire in the surrounding sectors, revealing their positions prematurely. What was once an interconnected, rational, mathematical defense system began to act with fear. The use of CBH-1 created an invisible side effect: disorganization. The tunnels next to the burned-out casemate were evacuated in a hurry, even without any direct attack. The temperature radiated by the ground, and the sound of the fuel being released provoked instinctive escape responses. In the following days, American intelligence reports would show a pattern. After each action of the flamethrower tank, the Japanese began to abandon nearby fortifications without confrontation. The stone fortress was intact, but the doctrine that supported it was beginning to dissolve. Sergeant Wyatt, upon returning to the forward base, was interrogated by 3 logistics officers and 2 weapons technicians. They wanted to know details. How many seconds of fire? What is the angle? How much did the tank retreat after the impact? Each shot was a new equation to be calculated, adapted, perfected. The CBH-1431 would be refueled, calibrated, and sent back into combat 12 hours later, this time with a new type of experimental fuel, a denser, slower mixture that extended combustion time even after the initial impact. The irony of this story is that the solution to winning the underground war was not in the skies, nor on the aircraft carriers, nor in the elite divisions. It was in front of them, waiting for adaptation. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts forgotten by the surface of history, like and subscribe. This support allows more reports like this, human, technical, and decisive, to continue to be brought to light. The CBH-1 would soon cease to be an experiment. It would become a key part of an entire doctrine, the tactic the Marines came to call corkscrew and burn, screwing the enemy into their shelter before sealing them with fire. But for that, more than a gun was needed. It was necessary to synchronize men, machines, and method, and what began with a single shot would become, in the coming days, a military gear where even the air became a weapon. The next installment reveals how the United States turned flamethrower tanks into the core of a new art of attack, one that dispensed with heroism and required only calculation. On the 11th day of the battle for Iwo Jima, something that was not in any Japanese doctrine manual began to happen. Soldiers retreated, not out of cowardice, not for betrayal, but because they had discovered a kind of death that could not be fought. Fire, unlike bullets, could not be faced with a suicide charge. He didn't give a chance to shoot, nor did he offer a target. It emerged, filled the space, and annulled the body. The caves, once sanctuaries of the resistance, came to be feared by the defenders themselves. The reports collected by American intelligence point to a pattern that was growing by the day. Japanese soldiers abandoning tunnels even before combat, burning documents and looking for open positions where they could at least see the enemy who would kill them. The doctrine of honorable death provided for falling under gunfire, preferably in hand-to-hand combat. But the flamethrower did not allow this. He took away the sound, the time, and even the sense of choice. Men laid down their weapons and fled empty-eyed, not for defeat but for the loss of military identity, because to die as steam was not to die in combat. It was to be erased. The fire did not hurt. He canceled. General Kuribayashi, even in his last intercepted communique, tried to reaffirm the values of total resistance, but its officers reported unexplained casualties, abandoned positions without order, and soldiers entering a state of apathetic silence. The code of honor itself, the Bushido, was beginning to crumble under the weight of an impersonal death. The war was no longer between soldiers. It was between a merciless machine and men locked in stone. A report dated March 2nd cites a conversation between two officers of the Japanese 312th Regiment, hiding in one of the central tunnels. "If we don't hear their footsteps, it's too late. The fire will come like the wind." It was the recognition that the logic of combat had changed. Americans now didn't just dominate the terrain. They dominated time. They chose when to start and, more importantly, when to finish. American intelligence noticed the psychological breakdown before the infantry command. Radio operators reported abrupt drops in Japanese communication frequency after each flamethrower attack. Silence did not mean discipline. It meant isolation, fear, and slow death. Japanese units began burying their own men inside the collapsed tunnels, not as an honor but as a containment of smell, trauma, and remembrance. In an intercepted letter from a dying officer to the high command, a sentence revealed the new terror. "They don't want to kill us, they want to erase us without us being able to die properly." The symbolic war was lost, and with it, the soul of an entire army. The doctrine of sacrifice, so ingrained in earlier campaigns, was for the first time met by a weapon that did not allow sacrifice. Because there was no scene, there was no confrontation. The jet of fire invaded, burned, and disappeared. American thermal reconnaissance cameras began to detect smaller heat masses in previously overcrowded caves. This indicated not only losses, but voluntary emptying. Soldiers left their positions not to surrender, but to escape a death that offered no dignity. The Japanese philosophy of war was based on combat as redemption. But against the CBH-1, there was no redemption. There was annihilation without witnesses. In post-war interviews with Japanese prisoners, the pattern repeats itself. The fear of fire was greater than the fear of the bomb. A former officer captured in the southern sector stated, "I would rather be hit by artillery. The fire enters you before you can scream." Another described the moment he saw comrades throwing themselves out of a burning tunnel, unarmed, running straight for the American lines. They were men indoctrinated never to surrender, and yet, they chose the risk of surrender to the certainty of dying without form. The impact of CBH-1 was more than lethal. It was doctrinaire. He broke the link between the Japanese soldier and his reason for fighting. Meanwhile, on the American side, the operators of the flamethrower tanks were also beginning to report the psychological effects of the weapon. Many described the silence after the shooting as the hardest part. There was no counterattack. There was no answer. Only the sound of metal cooling and the image of a bunker that once spewed bullets, now exhaling smoke. The power of a CBH-1 wasn't just in its flame. It was in what it erased, the spirit of traditional combat. The most feared weapon on the island didn't explode. It saturated it. As the island was slowly conquered, sector by sector, American commanders began to prioritize the use of CBH-1s for areas where resistance was more symbolic than strategic. Not for cruelty, but for efficiency. The places where resistance to the last bullet was expected now gave way with the first jet of fire. The logic of the war had been reversed, and by the time Japanese intelligence finally grasped the scope of the new weaponry, it was too late. They had trained to die, but not to disappear, and on the modern battlefield, this difference was fatal. In total, the final statistics indicate that more than 30% of Japanese casualties on Iwo Jima were caused directly or indirectly by incendiary weapons, most of them launched by CBH-1 tanks. What started as a logistical experiment has turned into a psychological vector, and the impact of this new logic would go beyond the island, because what was revealed there in dark tunnels and sealed chambers was only the first indication of an even greater transformation, the conversion of fire into doctrine. And the next step in this transformation involved total coordination, infantry, engineering, and armor. The next advance would not come with more force, but with more method, and with it would come the consolidation of hell on tracks. The doctrine that would seal the fate of Iwo Jima was not born on command tables or in military treaties. It emerged in the field, in practice between explosions and survival recalibrations. Dubbed by the Marines themselves as corkscrew and burn, the technique combined infantry, flamethrower tanks, and engineering with near-choreographed precision. The principle was simple but lethal. The enemy would not be attacked head-on, but surrounded by spiral lateral approaches, forced to retreat in previously mapped corridors until trapped, and when there was nowhere else to run, the fire would come in. The CBH-1s operated like thermal scalpels, eliminating the vital points of the defensive structure with coordinated jets. Each advance was preceded by combat engineers who identified tunnel entrances, positioned explosive charges to seal alternate exits, and marked with fluorescent paint the places of greatest thermal risk. The infantry, in turn, divided into pressure and containment squads, forcing the internal movement of the Japanese, forcing them to reveal themselves or suffocate. It wasn't just an attack, it was a forced extraction of the resistance, and it worked. The CBH-1 has gone from being a weapon to becoming the core of a new architecture of warfare. Each tank began to operate with an exclusive team, a specialized driver, a weapons operator with thermal training, and a reloading technician, responsible for maintaining the pressure of the fuel tanks at optimal levels. This small group operated in sync with the ground platoon. Upon identifying a fortified position, the infantry isolated the perimeter and signaled the tank, which was approaching with millimeter precision. The flamethrower was activated only when heat dispersion could be maximized, often at steep angles, where the fire flowed through the tunnels as a controlled fluid. There was no hurry. American doctrine now operated with time and method. With each bunker eliminated, the island became less of a fortress and more of a laboratory for the application of calculated force. Efficiency reports began to be collected by the V-Corps command in real time. In just 4 days of using the corkscrew and burn technique, the Japanese resistance rate in fortified positions dropped from 78% to 22%. This meant in practice that most soldiers left the shelters even before the first shot of the tank. The fear of the gun trumped the doctrine of sacrifice. More than that, the American operating system now functioned as an organism. Engineers detected it, the infantry isolated, the tank was incinerated, and the artillery in the background offered accurate cover. Each element knew its function and, more importantly, its time to act. It was a symphony of efficient destruction. On the Japanese side, the intercepted reports showed growing desperation. Officers who had previously called for reinforcements began calling for dynamite to seal tunnels before tanks reached them. The perception was no longer of combat, but of containment of death. Some soldiers took to hiding outside the defensive structures, waiting for the chance to return after the tank withdrew. But the American system provided for this type of behavior. Thermal reconnaissance drones, operated from captive balloons, have begun mapping waste heat zones, and the suspicious areas were then swept away by new attack or immediate occupation. The war was now a game of sensors, routes, and atmospheric pressure. Japan was fighting with courage, America with calculation. In a later interview, Lieutenant Colonel James V. Day, decorated on Iwo Jima, summed up the operation in a dry sentence. "We have learned to make the enemy give up before we find him." That was the new tactic. It was no longer necessary to invade every meter. It was enough to create a pattern of destruction that would lead the enemy to anticipate fate. The combination of infantry and tank became so efficient that some sectors of the island were conquered without an exchange of fire. The sound of the CBH-1 and the smell of smoke were enough to cause abandonment. The tank didn't just kill bodies, it killed the motivation to fight. U.S. troops began to receive specific instructions on how to identify the signs of psychological breakdown. Irregular movements in tunnels, evacuations without resistance, an increase in the number of suicides among isolated Japanese soldiers. All of this was interpreted as indicators that the method was working. And so, with each bunker sealed, each entrance destroyed with fire, the island lost its defensive function. But what the Americans still didn't know is that, at a specific point on the map, General Kuribayashi kept one last letter. An underground complex never detected by radar or aerial observation. A command center dug 75 meters underground, supplied for weeks. It was there that he prepared the most unexpected counterattack of the campaign, and the reveal of that bunker, and what happened when a CBH-1 finally approached it, will be the focus of the next installment. When Japanese planners conceived of the defense of Iwo Jima, they relied on a solid premise. Geography would be their ally. Vertical cliffs, layered tunnels, chasms carved by volcanic activity. All these elements were used as natural barriers, defensive multipliers. American naval artillery, as powerful as it was, could not reach certain angles. Aerial bombardments, even precise, did not penetrate the sloping caves. But what no one anticipated was the creation of a weapon that would bend these physical limitations with applied engineering. The CBH-1 did not attack from above or from the front. He went around, repositioned, calculated, and hit where nothing else could go. An emblematic example occurred on the slope of the Echo sector, where a Japanese position known to the Americans as Crow's Nest had held out since the first day of fighting. Excavated laterally from a cliff with a narrow opening and volcanic concrete armor, it was considered immune to any form of conventional attack. No grenades, no mortars, no bombs had had any effect. But on the morning of March 4th, CBH-1 number 438 was positioned on a plateau below the cave entrance. Using a system of mirrors assembled by field engineers and thermal dispersion calculations, the operator fired the flamethrower in a 78-degree inclined arc. The jet of fire rose like a red-hot blade, bending under gravity and entering the crevice as if guided by hand. Within seconds, the Crow's Nest fell silent. Forever. This type of attack, impossible by traditional doctrines, began to be replicated throughout the front line. Horizontal caves, pillboxes under rocky ledges, tunnels dug downhill, all the blind spots of the war became viable targets. The effective range of the CBH-1, which officially was 80 to 90 meters in a straight line, was now extended by topographical calculations and field engineering. Operators have become experts in flame behavior. They knew how the wind altered course, how the adherent heat behaved when it hit uneven surfaces, how to create thermal waves that ran through corridors with minimal fuel consumption. It was the fusion of thermal science with military practice, and with that, geography stopped protecting. He began to condemn. The natural fortress of Iwo Jima was, little by little, dismantled by weapons that had never been foreseen in the defense plans. In areas where even the Marines themselves did not expect success, the tanks advanced, and each advance reconfigured the tactical map. The so-called Cave 14F, excavated 30 meters deep under a basaltic formation, had been built to withstand even the direct impact of 500-pound bombs, and he resisted, but it collapsed after 2 consecutive shots from the CBH-1 446, which flooded the entrance with fire and consumed the internal oxygen. No explosion, no visible destruction, just the collapse of the air and the final silence. When the Marines entered days later, they found the bodies of the defenders lying intact, but suffocated. The fire hadn't even touched his clothes, but he had won, because now even air was a weapon. This type of operation required something that Japan no longer had: rapid adaptation. Japanese doctrine was fixed, rigid, written in indelible ink on the idea of honor. The Americans, on the other hand, operated with pencil and eraser. They adjusted, they tested, they corrected it. A CBH-1 that failed in a sector was immediately recalled and modified. In 2 days it returned with a new configuration, and with each modification, a lesson. With each lesson, an advance. This cycle, creation, testing, tweaking, application, is what separated American industrial prowess from Japanese craftsmanship. A tank was burning, but a well-run production chain burned an entire island. And this is where the comparison with Germany takes on its most ironic tone. In 1944, while the United States was producing 49,000 tanks, Germany was barely able to deliver 17,000, many of them incomplete, others obsolete at the time of delivery. American production of vehicular flamethrowers was 11 times greater than Nazi Germany's total capacity to adapt weaponry to armor. 11 times. And even with this overwhelming difference, German doctrine remained centered on tactical superiority on the battlefield, as if that were enough against an assembly line fed by 3 shifts a day and thousands of trained workers. If this data surprises you, comment below. Logistics wins, because that's exactly what happened on Iwo Jima. Logistics won, and not by chance, but by design. The corkscrew and burn system, now applied with maximum efficiency, was only the visible arm of a much larger logic. Each CBH-1 in the field was maintained by a steady stream of supplies: flammable fuel, spare parts, backup operators, engineering support, and even field psychologists, assigned to keep track of mental impacts on operators. The Pacific War, at that point, was no longer just about who had the most soldiers. It was about who better understood war as a process, and not even the points considered unattainable by the American doctrine itself escaped. Sector Bravo 9 housed what the Japanese called the heart of the rock, a complex of vertical caves that could only be accessed by ropes or direct climbing. It was an artillery position, but also a symbol. On March 6, after failed attempts to take the front, the U.S. command authorized a joint escalation and fire operation. A CBH-1 was hoisted by hydraulic winches adapted from agricultural tractors, repositioned high on a rocky plateau, and from there fired at a downward angle over the caves. The attack lasted 11 seconds. The silence, a whole hour. When the infantry arrived, they found the heart of the stone empty except for molten equipment and the smell of burning kerosene. Not a single shot had been fired. No resistance offered. Because against the impossible, there was now method. But the highest and lowest point of this transformation was yet to come. Because in a sector ignored by the initial maps, the Americans would find something that no one expected: an underground base with hospital capacity, its own supply, and live prisoners. The next part reveals the moment when fire found what it should never burn: humanity within the enemy. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's final report was intercepted by American intelligence cryptographers 7 days before his death. Dated March 17, 1945, it was not a formal document, but a handwritten letter to the Imperial General Staff. His words no longer carried the rhetoric of moral victory or the slogans of sacrifice. They were, on the contrary, almost scientific. The bombs crushed us, but it was the fire that disintegrated us. No position resists that which moves without fear and enters where man cannot. In another line, the tone was even more direct. The Americans defeated us with imagination. Kuribayashi, the same architect of the underground fortress, the man who for months had drawn every line of defense on the island like a surgeon of death, now recognized the collapse not by force, but by adaptation. Its recognition was not one of military defeat, but of conceptual failure. He had prepared his men to withstand a storm of steel, to face Marines in charge and bombs in sequence, but he had not prepared for a tank that shot flaming liquid inside the oxygen itself, and even less so, for the cold and routine logic with which this weapon was operated. Kuribayashi jotted down, with almost clinical accuracy, the statistics collected by his officers before the fall of the command tunnels. In an excerpt, he wrote, "In the Alpha and Delta sectors, in 3 days, the Americans eliminated 138 positions with less than 10 tanks. The defenses that had held out for months evaporated within hours." These words, spoken by the commander of the resistance, had more force than any propaganda. There was no exaggeration. There was restrained admiration, a veiled acknowledgement that while Japan was digging into the island, the United States was digging into the future. The machine that defeated Iwo Jima wasn't just a modified armored vehicle. It was a reflection of a culture of warfare based on production, speed, and testing. And Kuribayashi knew it. His letter closes with a phrase that never reached its destination, but which today resonates as an epitaph of all Japanese resistance. Our tunnels have not been invaded. They were filled with the invisible fire of Western logic. The Marines who intercepted the last radio signals from the Japanese defenders began to notice a pattern. Shorter transmissions, almost always encrypted by silence. Some soldiers tried to imitate non-existent attacks or reinforcements. Others asked for permission to burn their own files before the CBH-1 arrived. The idea of collective surrender was unthinkable, but the idea of continuing to fight in sealed caves muffled by fire no longer made sense. Morality was not lost. It dissolved like steam, and Kuribayashi, isolated in the central bunker, watched it happen without being able to interfere. In his later accounts, he describes speechless soldiers, burnt eyes without flame, and bodies found with no visible mark. Death was no longer the climax of courage. It was the end of a strategic mistake. The impact of the letter was devastating for the Japanese leadership. When deciphered and translated, it circulated among the Allied high commands as a rare symbol, the admission of the vanquished enemy, made not with desperation, but with clarity. The general who built one of the most sophisticated defenses of the war recognized with mathematical accuracy the collapse of his own plan. And this confession, coming from within the heart of the system, gave Americans the assurance that their new doctrine of assault was not only effective, it was superior, not out of arrogance but by proof. An enemy commander admitted that failure did not come from numerical inferiority, but from the innovation of others. Japan was overcome not by force, but by method, and it was this kind of analysis, cold, almost scientific, that Nazi Germany ignored until it was too late. While the United States put flamethrower tanks into real operation with a daily feedback loop, Germany still insisted on prestige weapons such as the Tiger II, whose total production did not reach 500 units, many of them never completed. The CBH-1, a functional and inexpensive adaptation, was manufactured in more than 1,500 examples in the space of months, each of them tested, adjusted, and repurposed with minimal margin of error. This difference is not only in numbers, it is in philosophy of war. Germany believed that a tank should be invincible. America believed it should work, and it worked. Throughout the Pacific Islands, in every meter of tunnel, in each silence that the fire interrupted. Kuribayashi's end came without public glory. His body was never found. The last radio broadcast captured, at 3:14 a.m., said only, "If there is still a sun, it has risen somewhere else." It was the voice of a commander who saw his own doctrine fall under a gun he could not name. And it is precisely this point, the name, that led the Japanese to avoid direct records of the CBH-1. In diaries of captured soldiers, he was called the fire monster, the blind dog, or simply that, because their presence was not recognized as part of traditional warfare. It was something else, something that shifted the logic of conflict to a new place. It is unacceptable. And while the caves of Iwo Jima crumbled in heat and silence, American engineers were already working on the next version of the vehicular flamethrower, a lighter, faster reloading, and superior penetration capacity, because the war was not over yet. And what worked on Iwo Jima would now be carried forward, to Okinawa, to mainland Japan as far as it was needed. But there was something deeper in this advance. Fire, which began as a tool of tactical cleansing, was now treated as a doctrine of rupture. And in the next part we will see the impact of this doctrine on Okinawa, where the weapon, already refined, would face the longest and bloodiest battle in the Pacific, and where for the first time, even civilians would feel the heat of what German generals still called conventional warfare. The first flamethrower tank to be neutralized on Iwo Jima did not fall by a clear shot, nor by coordinated artillery. It was destroyed by a man. A single Japanese soldier, armed with a Type 99 magnetic mine, crawled through the rubble until he reached the flank of CBH-1 No. 417. The explosion did not pierce the front hull, but misaligned the turret and damaged the ignition system. The Americans noted the loss. The Japanese celebrated as if they had won an entire campaign. From that moment on, the Imperial Army's most desperate counter-strategy emerged, the Shogeki-Tai, suicide detachments specifically designed to destroy tanks. Groups of 2 or 3 soldiers, usually young and without heavy weapons, equipped with stick grenades, hand mines, or improvised incendiary cocktails. The mission was simple: run to the tank and destroy yourself with it. The effectiveness, however, was close to nil, because the CBH-1 did not operate alone. Each unit was protected by a section of infantry, always on the move, and coordinated with forward observers. Almost all of the approaches ended in crossfire before the first jump. Even so, the Japanese command insisted. In the absence of industrial resources, they relied on courage as a last logistical resort. The field manuals were rewritten in the field with guidelines that sounded more like laments than strategies. If you can't stop him, burn yourself with him. It was the admission of a war fought without tools. Japanese doctrine went back to the Middle Ages, while the Americans operated combined systems of destruction based on chemistry, engineering, and tactical synchronization. For each sabotage attempt, the tanks came back more armored. For each suicide attack, more protection perimeters were added. The result was predictable. With each Japanese offensive, the American front line advanced, not out of heroism, but by engineering. They also tried the 47mm guns, light pieces originally designed to face armor in direct combat. Positioned in camouflaged caves and connected by manual intercom systems, they were deployed at the exact moment the launch tank approached. The problem: the CBH-1 never presented itself from the front. Its spiral maneuvers, the well-known corkscrew doctrine, exposed only protected sides and rotating turrets with a firing angle greater than the range of the enemy gun. In theory, the gun could pierce a medium-armored vehicle. In practice, he rarely had time to fire more than once. Field data show that out of every 10 47mm shots against CBH-1s, only 1.3 resulted in relevant structural damage. By contrast, for every CBH-1 in operation, More than 28 Japanese positions were eliminated on average in a 36-hour interval. The gap between desire and result widened. Japanese resistance, though fervent, was now statistical. The bitter irony deepened with each attempt to react. In one operation in the eastern sector, Japanese soldiers attempted to dig vertical tunnels that reached the ground beneath American tanks. The idea was simple: destroy from below. But reality intervened. The volcanic land was unstable, time was scarce, and the tanks moved before the excavations were completed. The effort cost days of work and dozens of lives. The result? No damage to the enemy. Just one more indication that on Iwo Jima, Japan was fighting an adversary that had not fought in the same century. While the Japanese improvised mines with artillery scrap, the Americans produced gelled fuel in field laboratories, adjusting its viscosity according to the altitude and humidity of the island. While Japanese officers distributed handwritten orders by messengers, the Americans coordinated attacks with embarked FM radios, allowing tanks and infantry to act as a single organism. War was no longer a contest of bravery. It became an equation, and Japan, as much as it struggled with faith, could no longer solve the mathematics of destruction. In a later analysis by the U.S. Corps of Engineers, one officer summed up the asymmetry. They attacked with bodies. We respond with lawsuits. That was the real American victory. It wasn't just the weaponry. It was the supply chain, the response time, the ability to replenish and adapt. Each damaged CBH-1 was analyzed, modified, returned to the field in 2 or 3 days. The Japanese, with no means of replacement, no factory, no access to new components, resorted to the desperate reuse of materials and human sacrifice as a tactical tool. It was an abyss, and there was no possible bridge. The last major counterattack against the CBH-1s took place in the Charlie sector on the night of 12th of March. About 40 Japanese soldiers, many wounded, launched a night attack against an American detachment in reload. They advanced with low silhouettes, using darkness and relief. For a few minutes, there was chaos. 1 tank was damaged, 2 Marines killed. But at dawn, the Americans regained control with air support and logistical replacement. Within 24 hours, all tanks were operational again. The Japanese, in turn, no longer had reserves. That had been his last offensive with critical mass. After that, only isolated groups remained, waiting for a death that they already knew would come. And herein lies the final irony of this part. Japan, a civilization shaped by discipline, planning, and reverence for method, ended its greatest island defense by resorting to improvisation, emotional reaction, and the desperate attempt to fight steel with meat. Meanwhile, the United States, a young and pragmatic nation, demonstrated that the war in the 20th century would be won not by those who fought most fervently, but by those who could repeat the same deadly gesture with industrial precision. And this repetition was still far from over. Because while the tunnels of Iwo Jima were sealed with fire, the maps of Okinawa were already being marked with the same doctrine. And in it, there was no room for romanticism, only for results. And that's exactly what we'll see in the next part. How the same weapon, now refined, would be used in an even larger field, against an enemy already broken, but not yet surrendered. When flamethrower tanks began operating on Iwo Jima, they were seen by the Japanese as anomalies, temporary aberrations on the battlefield. But in less than 3 weeks, that perception changed. What once seemed like an isolated tactical device has become the center of gravity of U.S. ground operations in the Pacific. The CBH-1 ceased to be support weapons to become the axes around which an entire doctrine revolved. The war had changed, not by chance, but by design. The Americans weren't just testing new weapons, they were redesigning the concept of military assault based on integration. Each tank advance was now accompanied by specialized combat engineers with linear explosives, cutting tools, and rudimentary acoustic sensors to locate tunnels. Around them, infantry squadrons protected the flanks, cleared the surroundings, and ensured that the pressure of the advance was continuous. Behind, logistics operators repositioned supplies, refueled incendiary fuel, and swapped parts in real time. And at the top, artillery and communications observers established connections between the fronts and the command centers. It was an orchestra of fire, and the CBH-1 was the conductor. This structure, known in military reports as a combined fortified penetration unit, did not exist at the start of the war. It was developed in the field, based on the American logic of experimentation under real fire, and the reason for its effectiveness was simple. It treated battle as an industrial process. Where Japan saw each position as a stronghold to be defended with honor, the Americans saw an obstacle to be dismantled with technique. Where the Japanese put emotion, the Americans applied calculus. The result was a series of operations with almost mathematical precision. In one of them, in the Delta 6 sector, a fortified cave that had withstood 3 aerial bombardments was taken in less than 9 minutes. First, the CBH-1 advanced through the line of cover with infantry support. Next, an engineering team cut hand-blasting wires that connected booby traps at the entrance. Soon after, a 60-meter jet of fire sealed the entrance with heat. The sensors indicated lateral movement. Another jet was fired, this time with denser kerosene, which flowed through the tunnels and eliminated internal resistance. By the end of the operation, 8 American soldiers had participated. No injuries. On the Japanese side, 34 dead, without a single shot fired in return. This type of operation was repeated in several parts of the island. The combined assault doctrine, which in 1942 was only theoretical, was now mature, and its power came precisely from the ability to multiply the efficiency of the main weapon, the flame tank, through coordinated specializations. While the Germans were still operating under the concept of blitzkrieg centered on autonomous armor, the Americans created a modular system where each fraction of troops had a synergistic function. The tank was the lung, the infantry, the eyes, the engineers, the hands, communication, the nervous system, and at the center of it all, the doctrine, adaptable, evolving, merciless. Japan simply could not imitate this model. It lacked everything: a flexible command structure, technical reserves, trained workers, access to spare materials, bombing-resistant communication channels, and above all, time. Each day that American doctrine became more accurate, Japanese doctrine became more solitary. The Japanese soldier, isolated in his cave, was no longer fighting the enemy. He was fighting the advance of a mentality, the idea that modern warfare could be won with organized repetition rather than individual climaxes, the idea that survival was not a tactical choice but a condition for efficiency. That was the biggest difference, and she wasn't in the tanks. It was in the mind of those who operated them. General Holland Smith, commander of the Marines on Iwo Jima, acknowledged this in one of his classified reports. "We did not win because we had fire. We won because we had a role." The phrase, short and austere, synthesized a truth that Japan could never achieve. The real power of the weapon was not in its destruction, but in the way it was applied within a system. And this system, fueled by uninterrupted logistics, technical thinking, and decentralized decision networks, was America's real weapon. The tank was setting fire, but the winner was the method, and this method was now replicating, like a living cell. Combined units were standardized. Training on Hawaiian soil simulated caves. Lightning courses instructed engineers in basic thermodynamics and heat transmission. New versions of the CBH-1 were being tested with twin thrusters, sealed tanks, and improved ignition. The doctrine was no longer experimental. It was a doctrinal production line, and with it, Americans not only won battles, but created a new paradigm of warfare that would be exported into the future. The Japanese, even the most experienced, could not keep up with the transformation. In a testimony captured by radio, an artillery officer isolated in Nishi stressed, "They don't advance. They infiltrate. They don't attack. They disassemble." The language was exact. The combat no longer had a face. The enemy came in modules. A wave of fire followed by millimeter precision. There was no room for heroes. There were functions, and when the functions worked together, heroism was no longer necessary. Efficiency remained. In Okinawa, this doctrine would reach its fullness. But there, on Iwo Jima, she was born with clarity. The transition from force to method, from weapon to system, from courage to calculation. And it was this calculation, cold, iterative, uninterrupted, that marked the century. Germany, with all its technical apparatus, never foresaw a doctrine so banal as it was deadly: to apply fire with mathematical precision until nothing was left to resist. And in the next part, we will see how this doctrine was exported, refined, and taken to the extreme on the largest battlefield in the Pacific, where the enemy was not just armed, he was desperate, and where even the Earth itself seemed to resist the logic of collapse. The redoubts of Iwo Jima were works of military engineering that at first glance defied any logic of rapid conquest. Natural caves reinforced with volcanic concrete, imported steel doors, manual ventilation systems, and buried cable communications. Some bunkers even had water reservoirs and makeshift hospitals. The doctrine was simple and brutal: resist to the last man, even if the world around him had already disappeared. At many points on the island, these positions had survived weeks of intense aerial bombardment and naval artillery. The crater of a 1,000-pound bomb sometimes barely scratched the surface of the underground system. The Japanese generals believed that, even isolated, these natural fortresses would keep the capacity for resistance alive. But they were about to discover that the depth of a bunker offered no shelter. It offered condemnation. The first collapse occurred in the stronghold known as Rocha Branca in the Delta sector, a 3-level complex interconnected by narrow tunnels designed to house more than 120 men. The interior walls had been reinforced with basalt slabs and bags of charred sand. Nothing had broken its structure until the day a CBH-1 approached. The jet of fire penetrated through the external ventilation opening, spread gelled fuel into the interior corridors, and evaporated the air. The flames did not spread like open flames, but like a boiling fluid, adhering to surfaces, exploding in microchambers and seeping through cracks. In less than 3 minutes, oxygen was consumed. The soldiers in the interior did not die fighting. They died trying to breathe. What had been projected as a bastion of absolute resistance was transformed into an extermination furnace. This pattern was repeated in dozens of positions. What was once the greatest defensive force, the underground shelter, became a structural weakness. American fire, instead of trying to break through the walls, used the structure itself against its occupants. The doctrine was now simple: identify openings, apply heat, seal with overpressure. The tanks released up to 150 gallons of fuel per minute, compressed by hydraulic pressure and lit with white phosphorus. The thermal impact was so immediate that in many cases no weapon was used after the initial firing. Silence was enough. And then, the white smoke. It is at this point in the narrative that it is worth pausing for the data that German planners never considered in their assessments of American industrial capacity. By 1944, the United States was producing 47,000 tanks a year, including variations and adapted models. Germany, in the same period, produced about 18,000, counting all types including turretless vehicles and inoperative tanks. The most shocking thing, however, is not in the raw numbers, but in the nature of the production. While the Germans invested in complex and difficult-to-maintain models, such as the Panther and the Tiger II, the Americans produced models such as the Sherman, versatile, interchangeable, and adaptable to different types of weaponry, such as the Flamethrower. If this contrast surprises you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because that's exactly what happened, not because of the isolated quality of each tank, but because of the ability to turn a production line into a continuous combat weapon. Another dramatic example occurred in the so-called Cave of the Thousand, a system of galleries where more than 70 Japanese soldiers were entrenched with reserves of ammunition and food for weeks. The place was considered impenetrable. Its entrances were fake, booby-trapped holes, and the real access was through a tunnel camouflaged under rocks. But the Americans, using rudimentary thermal sensors and systematic observation of the terrain, discovered the actual entrance. A single CBH-1 was positioned with air cover. It only took 2 shots for the flames to cascade through the tunnels. There was no exchange of fire. The bunker, once seen as a symbol of resistance, has become a sealed grave. The irony was unbearable. The more complex the redoubts, the more effective the tanks were against them. The Japanese defensive logic bet on enclosure, containment, and surprise. But the enemy now did not need to enter. All you had to do was find an access point and inject heat and gas. The fire did the rest. In American reports, the feeling of turning off a stronghold was described as turning off an engine, a technical, precise action without emotional involvement. The combat had lost face. It had become an engineering function. Japanese officials began to realize that bunker doctrine had become obsolete in real time. In intercepted transmissions, phrases such as "we are sealed," "the air is gone," and "another sealed entrance" have become frequent. The battlefield was no longer fought over terrain. It was fought over oxygen. and in this environment, the Americans held the absolute advantage. With each tank moving with enough fuel to burn for 90 seconds continuously, and with rapid reloading ensured by support trucks, the lines advanced in precise cycles. Every 400 meters, a new bunker was sealed. Every day, fire replaced doctrine. An emblematic case was recorded in the Echo sector. A stronghold that had resisted since the first day of the invasion fell in 14 minutes, after a side shot went through a crack in the stone and lit the interior like an oil lamp. After the attack, the Marines found equipment still intact, weapons, ammunition, radios, and dozens of bodies with clear signs of thermal asphyxiation. None had fired, none had fled, none had beaten the technology. Japanese defensive engineering, hitherto regarded as exemplary, had been surpassed not by stronger weapons but by simpler weapons, operated with ruthless precision. The lesson was clear. You cannot win a war of repetition with a doctrine of exception. The courage is admirable, but against pressurized heat it becomes combustible. And it is exactly at this point that the war on Iwo Jima ceased to be a conflict between armies, and became an equation of time and heat. And if the bunkers of Iwo Jima collapsed from the inside, what about the even larger fortifications built on Okinawa? In the next part, we'll look at how flamethrower tanks evolved, not just as weapons, but as agents of doctrine, capable of mapping and eliminating the last hope of Japanese resistance with surgical precision. The numbers that emerged from the post-battle reports from Iwo Jima were not just statistics. They were silent testimonies of a paradigm shift. For the first time, the land war in the Pacific had been won, in large part, not by numerical superiority or by the gradual taking of positions, but by a specific weapon, integrated into a system that multiplied its effectiveness with millimeter precision. The result: more than 30% of officially counted Japanese casualties were directly caused by incendiary weapons, a figure that, at first reading, seemed exaggerated, but that, in light of the physical evidence and the reports of combat, became incontestable. The Japanese defensive logic built around resilience had been swallowed up by a statistic. Fire did not only kill, he annulled doctrines. The impact of these weapons on the very structure of the American forces was also measured. Sectors operating with integrated flamethrower tanks showed up to a 40% reduction in casualties compared to conventional assault units. In other words, where the CBH-1 advanced, fewer soldiers died. The logic was simple but relentless. Replace human risk with industrial heat. This replacement was not just pragmatic, it was ideological. It represented a new way of thinking about war. Fewer heroes, more efficiency. Less emotion, more calculation. And in every line of the report, this philosophy asserted itself. There were more than 1,000 fortified positions destroyed directly by flamethrower tanks over the course of the Iwo Jima campaign. There was no geographical pattern. There was no specific type of target. Caves, bunkers, tunnels, galleries, ambush trenches. All were swept away by jets of compressed fuel, propelled at a speed exceeding 150 km/h and temperatures above 200 degrees Celsius. The effect was not only lethal, it was transformative. Fortifications once considered impregnable became vulnerable not because of a design flaw, but because of inadequacy in the face of a weapon that had not even been conceived at the time the tunnels were dug. The war evolved in months, and the Japanese defenses aged in days. Range was another variable that redefined the rules of the battlefield. The portable flamethrower models used by infantry had limited range, between 15 and 20 meters, depending on wind, pressure, and type of fuel. The CBH-1, on the other hand, could hit targets at more than 60 meters, with unparalleled accuracy and volume of fire. This meant that a tank could seal the entrance to a cave before it was even within direct visual range of defenders. What's more, the fire could be fired at an angle, allowing it to reach elevated or hidden positions behind rocks. Naval artillery did not offer such accuracy. The infantry had no such security. Only the tank combined both. In logistical terms, the tanks launched an average of 50 bursts per mission. Each burst consumed between 5 and 10 gallons of incendiary fuel. The fuel, stored in shielded reservoirs and heated by internal electrical resistances, was ignited at the time of exit through the nozzle, ensuring a continuous and projected flame. The tanks returned to base for reloading and maintenance, and in less than an hour they were operational again. A supply chain had been created just to power this fire machine. Mobile workshops, modified napalm and kerosene deposits, cooling units and line maintenance squads. The gun worked because the system around it worked. Each shot was sustained by an invisible, but fundamental, logistical intelligence chain. It is at this point that historical irony reaches its apex. Germany, at its peak, underestimated this kind of power. Their intelligence reports described the U.S. military as numerous but disorganized, packed with average armaments, and dependent on brute force. None of these reports predicted that America's real strength lay in turning every piece, including the median, into a cog in a superior system. The flamethrower tank wasn't the best tank. It wasn't the most beautiful, not even the fastest, but he was the most adapted. And for this reason it was the most effective. The war ceased to be an armored duel to become a test of who could keep the heat burning for longer, and the Americans could do that indefinitely. If this finding impresses you, comment, "Shocking data," because that's what this war has become. A succession of numbers that, combined with strategy and method, dissolved the doctrine of sacrifice. What Japanese propaganda called the unwavering spirit was won by data, by calculations that showed where to place, when to fire, and how many units were needed to literally erase any hope of counterattack. And perhaps the most emblematic of these numbers is in a simple graph presented after the battle. The Japanese resistance curve collapses as flamethrower tanks increase in presence on the front lines. It was not an immediate victory. It was a downward curve. Every day, less resistance. With each shot, less conviction. The Japanese doctrine built on honor was defeated by statistics, and those statistics were fed by soldiers, operators, engineers, factory workers, all part of a larger system, none of them individually decisive, but together, unstoppable. This mathematics of fire would be carried forward. On Okinawa, where resistance was even more dense, tanks dropped more fuel in a single day than the entire arsenal of portable flamethrowers on Guadalcanal, and the results were so conclusive that the American High Command began to consider the weapon as an essential part of the strategy for an eventual invasion of mainland Japan. But there was a new obstacle on the horizon, a problem that no statistics could predict: civilians. And in the next part, we will see how the same weapon that revolutionized the battlefield found in Okinawa the human limit of its application, and how this moral shock almost redefined the very doctrine it had helped to create. The power that emerged from the mouths of flamethrower tanks wasn't just physical, it was existential, and no man who wielded it came out unscathed. American CBH-1 crews, often celebrated as the most advanced point of assault doctrine, carried on their shoulders not only the tactical responsibility of breaking through Japanese resistance, but the psychological weight of operating the most feared weapon in the Pacific. These tanks did not fire projectiles. They evaporated human beings, in seconds, in silence, at such a close distance that, in some cases, it was possible to hear the screams before the oxygen ran out. Soldiers like Corporal James O'Donnell, a flamethrower operator in the 5th Marine Corps, reported years later that each mission seemed to erase some of their own humanity. "I don't remember how many bunkers I burned, but I remember every time I dreamed about them afterwards," he wrote decades later in his unpublished memoirs. The American doctrine provided for the rotation of crews to avoid physical exhaustion, but no one knew how to deal with mental exhaustion. The heat inside the tank was unbearable even before it fired. The tension is constant. With each mission, the operators knew they were carrying the most effective and brutal weapon in their hands, and that the line between compliance with orders and permanent trauma was more tenuous than the steel that protected them. An operator of the 3rd Tank Battalion even fainted after setting fire to a cave that they later found to be full of children. No one blamed him, but he never returned to the field. It was war, but that didn't stop it from weighing. Army mental health officers began noticing a pattern among flamethrower operators: insomnia, apathy, episodes of dissociation. In internal reports, the condition began to be called burnout shell shock, a psychological state that mixed extreme exhaustion with moral breakdown. The men who operated the CBH-1 did not see themselves as heroes. Many didn't even want medals. They wanted to forget. Glory, so present in official communiques and headlines, seemed distant inside the armored cabins, where the air smelled of fuel and burning flesh. And yet, the mission continued. The efficiency of the tanks was irrefutable. For this reason, The high command avoided commenting on the side effects. In preparation sessions, soldiers were instructed to dehumanize the target, to view bunkers as machines, not shelters. But this dissociation was short-lived. All it took was one wrong burst. A non-standard scream. A body bursting into flames down the side of a cave. In one case recorded by the 2nd Marine Regiment, a tank operator shut down the system when he heard prayers in Japanese being recited by a group of wounded people. The infantry had to complete the mission. "Fire is not blind," said one sergeant, "but whoever carries it must pretend to be." American technology had overcome a logistical and tactical barrier, but now he faced a new limit, the psychological. The same system that coordinated engineers, infantry, and armor couldn't contain what happened inside a man's mind when he pulled a lever that spewed liquid death at 1200 degrees. Medical Corps psychologists began proposing longer rest cycles and post-mission support for these teams. But the war continued at an industrial pace, and the rotation was minimal. Tanks don't rest, and men, under pressure, pretend not to need it. The result was predictable. A generation of operators marked not by physical wounds, but by indelible memories. There was also silence. Many of these soldiers did not report what they felt, neither during nor after. It was easier to carry the weight alone than to try to explain it. For the command, it was a matter of function. For operators, it was a matter of emotional survival. Years later, interviews with veterans revealed how much loneliness was eroding. One operator summed it up: "You never forget the smell, not even when he is alone, especially when you're alone." And this isolation was not accidental. It was structural. No one wanted to hear about the consequences of a gun that worked so well. The cruel irony was this: the more effective the weapon, the more devastating its impact on those who operated it. The CBH-1 did not fail, but its operators, little by little, collapsed from within. The price of victory was paid not only in blood but in sanity. American superiority was real, but it wasn't clean. It was industrial, it was effective, and she was human, in the worst sense of the word. The machine was moving forward, but the men stayed behind. The moral tension worsened with the arrival of the news from Okinawa. There, reports pointed to the use of civilians as shields. Women, the elderly, and children in the tunnels. The weapon that had vanquished Iwo Jima now needed to be recalibrated, not in its functioning but in its application. The command started discussions about ethical limits, but the war did not wait, and the tanks were already ready to land. In the next part, we will see how the Okinawan battlefield forced strategists to face the ultimate dilemma: when the enemy is confused with the civilian, how to use a weapon that incinerates everything in its path, and how to reconcile technical victory with preserved humanity. What Iwo Jima started, Okinawa pushed to the limit, and the CBH-1, once a symbol of power, would become a symbol of a moral doubt that would echo to this day. It took place on the 9th day of fighting on Iwo Jima, Charlie Sector, south of Mount Suribachi. A small group of Japanese soldiers emerged from a narrow opening in the ground with their hands raised. They were not injured. They were not out of ammunition. Only had given up. To the U.S. Marines surrounding the position, the scene was almost absurd. Until then, all encounters with Japanese forces ended in resistance to the death, suicide attacks, or explosive silences. But on that day, 14 fighters chose to surrender. It was the first time in the entire Pacific campaign that this had happened in an active position, with no express order to retreat. And the reason wasn't tactical, it was psychological. In the words of an American intelligence interpreter who questioned the survivors, they said fire would come, and there was no honor in burning to death. This moment, silent and improbable, marked the collapse of a dogma. Bushido, the code of conduct of Japanese warriors, had sustained entire generations with the promise that dying fighting was the pinnacle of honor. Surrender was, by definition, a moral failure. Japanese military culture fed this idea with intensity: manuals, doctrines, imperial speeches. And until then, it worked. Even in the face of crushing defeats, Japanese soldiers fought to the end. But something has changed, and it wasn't a sudden change. It was the accumulation of days under attack from a weapon that offered no combat, only annihilation. The flamethrower tank left no room for heroism. He did not allow a last shot. He arrived and transformed the resistance into steam. When the enemy cannot be faced, the code loses meaning. More groups began to emerge, always small, always in silence, thin, dirty, unarmed men, and ashamed. One of them cried when he was captured, not out of fear, but out of shame. He apologized to his captain, even dead, before turning himself in. Another, captured after fleeing from a burned-out stronghold, said he tried to kill himself, but the grenade had failed. The fire has overcome us, but not as soldiers, as belief. The phrase was recorded in the war diary of the 26th Infantry Regiment and analyzed by military psychologists. It was the confirmation of what was already felt in the trenches. The American gun had won not only by force, but by symbol. He had turned the sacred ground of Japanese resistance into an oven, and no samurai code survived the idea of being burned alive without a fight. The irony of this story is that the collapse of an empire began with a heat that no sword could cut. If you're enjoying discovering how war is also made of symbols and how technology can burn myths beyond bunkers, show your support. Like and subscribe. This helps us continue to reveal the untold backstage of the battlefields. Reports from the American High Command began to register the phenomenon with caution. It was too early to call it a pattern. But the number of surrenders on Iwo Jima exceeded within a few days the total of all previous campaigns combined. There were not hundreds, but they were enough to indicate a crack. The doctrine of unconditional sacrifice was not invulnerable. It had a point of combustion, and the tanks had found that point. As the campaign progressed, a series of tunnels were found abandoned. In some, there was still ammunition, water, maps, and food, but the bodies were outside, many charred. Others simply lay in the fetal position, weapons at their sides. They did not die in combat. They died trying to escape. One of them was found with a white handkerchief in his hand. The war that was taking place on Iwo Jima made it clear that, for the first time, surrender was no longer an isolated exception and became a consequence of the doctrine of mechanical terror. For American strategists, this was more than victory. It was field transformation. The flamethrower tank was no longer an attack weapon. It became a vector of ideological collapse. General Keller Rocky, commander of the V Amphibious Corps, wrote in his report, "They don't just die. Now they retreat." And this retreat was not physical. It was doctrinaire. Japan had not yet fallen, but the myth of resistance to the end was already burning in ashes. The next part reveals the end point of this rupture, how even in the face of the possibility of certain death, some Japanese officers chose to try to capture flamethrower tanks, not to use them, but to understand what made them so destructive. It was the last effort of a military mind in the face of a world that burned faster than could be comprehended. When the engines of the flamethrower tanks went silent on Iwo Jima, it wasn't the end of a gun. It was the birth of a doctrine. The devastating effectiveness of the CBH-1 not only sealed the fate of the Japanese resistance, it redefined the role of fire on the modern battlefield. To the American High Command, the message was clear: combat underground, urban or in uneven terrain, required more than raw firepower. It required warmth, pressure, reach, and, above all, coordination. The success of Iwo Jima was carefully analyzed by the military planning offices in the following years, and the next war in Korea would prove that the lessons learned would not be forgotten. In 1951, during the UN offensive in Korea's frozen hills, a new kind of resistance began to emerge. Chinese troops entrenched in caves, valleys, and underground networks dug into the rock. Reports indicated that conventional weapons, artillery and aerial bombardments, had limited effectiveness. The scenario was alarmingly familiar, and that's when the United States decided to rescue a solution that had already proven its worth: flamethrower tanks, only this time with evolution. The M132 model, mounted on the chassis of the M113, was the direct heir to the Pacific CBH-1. Equipped with M10-8 flamethrowers, it could project fire more than 180 meters, keeping operators under lighter but extremely mobile armor. And like his predecessors, the tactical impact was immediate. The integrated assault doctrine, already tested on Iwo Jima, became standard. Infantry advancing alongside the flaming tanks, demolition crews positioned behind, artillery observers coordinating attacks before and after the flames. It was the same formula, adapted for the cold but with the same efficiency. In battles such as Heartbreak Ridge and Bloody Ridge, the use of armored flamethrowers shortened weeks of combat to a few days. The caves, once an impregnable refuge, have become ovens. The Chinese positions, inviolable under bombardment, collapsed within minutes with the advance of a single M132. The tactical legacy of Iwo Jima was therefore consolidated. It was no longer an experiment in desperation or an exotic weapon. It was institutionalized doctrine. The manuals of the Fort Benning Infantry School now include specific modules on combat, combined with flaming tanks. The Aberdeen Armament Center carried out detailed studies on the thermal effects on defensive structures, and the Department of Defense authorized the serial production of flamethrowers for light and medium vehicles. Liquid fire had entered the logic of war as an instrument of deterrence and assault. It was no longer a contingency. It was a recurring tool. That legacy was not limited to Korea. During the Vietnam War, the application of fire against Viet Cong tunnels, although often carried out with portable systems, still referred to the same mentality, eliminating spaces where the enemy believes he is safe. The strategic concept has not changed. What has changed are the geographic variables. But the principle was the same as that learned on the sands of Iwo Jima. Where there is entrenched resistance, fire is the final language. Military engineers continued to improve the system. The M67, derived from the Patton tank, was developed as a more robust successor with greater range, and although it was never employed on a large scale like the CBH-1, its existence confirmed that the American command did not see flamethrower tanks as vestiges of a past war, but as a vital component of future contingencies. Even when the Cold War brought the focus to nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, armored units kept flamethrower operating manuals in their arsenals, ready for reactivation. Interestingly, while the Allies embraced this doctrine, European armies, especially those that once underestimated American industry, did not follow suit. Germany, now divided, viewed with ambivalence the use of fire as a strategic weapon. The Eastern Army, under Soviet influence, prioritized missiles and heavy artillery. The West, more aligned with NATO, avoided applications that evoked traumatic images of the Second World War. It was a doctrinal and cultural divergence. But for the United States, the message had already been given. The war of the future would not be won by numbers or bravery. It would be won by integration. The greatest victory of flamethrower tanks may not be in the positions they have conquered, but in the structural transformation they have caused. They proved that the value of a weapon lies not only in its power, but in the way it fits into a larger operational logic. The CBH-1 did not beat Iwo Jima alone, but it was the link that allowed the American doctrine to adapt, evolve, and project force in a rational way. He was the symbol of a turnaround, a new way of thinking about combat. In the next part, we will delve into the destruction of a Japanese symbol, the Iwo Jima Central Underground Hospital, a complex that withstood shelling, artillery, and direct assault, but that succumbed within minutes to the pressurized heat of a single flamethrower tank. There, more than concrete, the idea that there was shelter against industry fell, and with it, the last hope of invisible resistance collapsed. When silence returned to Iwo Jima, it was not a sign of peace. It was the absence of an answer. In the years following the end of the war, a series of reports, letters, and interviews began to emerge from the Japanese side. Surviving officers, military doctors, and soldiers from underground garrisons wrote, some anonymously, others in posthumous memoirs, about what they really experienced beneath the island's surface. The records reveal something that does not appear on maps or in campaign manuals: the invisible face of collapse. Not the strategic collapse, but the collapse of the soul. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi, assigned to the northern sector of Iwo Jima, wrote years later, "We heard the tank before we saw it, but he didn't make the sound of a gun. He breathed, and then he moaned, and then everything turned red." His description coincides with dozens of other accounts which tell of the muffled sound of the flamethrower pressing into the air, followed by a pause, and then the burst, as if the earth itself exploded. Many describe the feeling of loss of air, not because of the smoke, but because the heat consumed the oxygen in the tunnels even before the fire touched them. One soldier dubbed the tank the Metal Dragon. Another, in a note found near a charred tunnel, wrote, "I'd rather fight 1,000 men than hear that breath once more." The defenses, designed to resist the bomb, became execution chambers. General Kuribayashi, even before the end, already warned in his internal reports, "Our bunkers resist explosions but not heat." and there is no vent against hell. The tunnel system itself, the pride of Japanese defensive engineering, functioned as a channeler of destruction. The fire, when injected under pressure into an inlet, traveled dozens of meters in seconds. Entire pillboxes, cordoned off by steel doors, were heated to hundreds of degrees before the soldiers had time to act. A Japanese engineer, captured alive, revealed in interrogation, "Our mistake was to believe that the Americans would fight hard. They struggled with chemistry." Among the reports, a pattern repeats itself: the feeling of helplessness. The war, which had previously allowed the final gesture of the grenade to the chest, the last bayonet charge, now ended without confrontation. Fire prevented heroism. An officer in the Imperial Army who survived a partially burned redoubt reported, "I trained to die with honor." But how do you die with honor when the enemy is not in front of you? When your last sight is the ceiling melting over your head? The impact was so profound that the Japanese War Ministry, after the defeat, commissioned a confidential study on the psychological effect of American weaponry. The document, declassified decades later, states, "The introduction of the mechanized flamethrower nullified our ability to maintain position. Their isolated presence was enough to break the morale of entire units." In a marginal note, an officer writes by hand, "It was like fighting the sun." The depth of this confession reveals something that the numbers do not tell. Fire did not win only by destruction. It won by anticipating destruction. The fear of being burned alive, imprisoned in stone, overcomes any combat instinct. One of the last diaries recovered on Iwo Jima contains the following annotation, made with shaky graffiti: "The earth betrayed us. We excavated our own grave. Now the sky breathes fire, and there is no more God here." But even in the face of annihilation, the reports do not cease in lament. Many recognize the power of the enemy with respect. A major of the Central Sector, after the war, declared at a conference, "The enemy we faced on Iwo Jima was not made up of soldiers only. It was made up of factories, engineers, ideas that we never foresaw. We lost before the first shot, because we fought the past, and they brought the future." This admission, coming from a military man who led resistance until the last few days, reveals the true impact of flamethrower tanks. Not only their tactical effectiveness, but their strength as a symbol of a new paradigm. Japan had prepared a war of courage and received a war of thermal calculation. The samurai doctrine, designed for close-quarters combat, met its end in the face of an armored hose with a range of 100 meters. The next installment will reveal the last stronghold to fall: the Central Underground Hospital, a complex built to withstand any attack. Equipped with naval steel doors and multiple ventilation, it has survived aerial bombardments, naval artillery attacks, and weeks of siege, but it did not survive a single flamethrower tank. There, between remedies and moral codes, Japanese engineering found its limit, and the American imagination, its victory. The fire that ran through the tunnels of Iwo Jima didn't just char concrete and bodies. It sealed, definitively, the end of an era. For the last time, the classic concept of war, centered on individual courage, heroic sacrifice, and direct engagement, collided with the reality of an enemy fighting with pressure, temperature, and systematic engineering. Iwo Jima was more than an island conquered. It was the stage where the ancestral warrior found industrial logic, where tradition met calculation, and he lost. The Japanese Empire, forged under the samurai code of honor, and refined by the imperial doctrine of the 20th century, believed in the redemptive power of death in combat. This belief shaped their defenses, their propaganda, their training. And for years it worked. In the jungles of Asia, on the reefs of the Pacific, in the skies of Pearl Harbor. But against an enemy that sought no glory but efficiency, the code shattered. The American flamethrower tank did not shout. It did not challenge. It did not hesitate. It just advanced, fired, reloaded, repeated. The war had changed languages, and Japan, like many others before and after it, spoke the wrong language. The rise of mechanical fire as a vector of military superiority symbolized more than a technical victory. It represented an ontological change. Courage alone was no longer enough. The tragic hero of the 19th century, the front-loading soldier, the air-duel pilot, all became obsolete in the face of the reality where the battlefield was decided by bomb pressure, logistical volume, and metallurgical fusions. Bravery was overcome by planning. Bravery for pressurized fuel. and there was no turning back. On Iwo Jima, each subterranean chamber conquered was not just a military position. It was a paragraph erased from an age-old doctrine. The surrender of Japanese soldiers, trained to die, showed that the spirit can be unbreakable until it encounters an adversary that offers no duel but mechanical execution. Industry, in this context, was not only a support for the war, she was the weapon itself, and this would profoundly mark all post-war conflicts. The strategists who studied Iwo Jima quickly understood. The combat of the future would not depend on the morale of its men, but on the imagination of its engineers. The fuel that would fuel armies would no longer be just ideological motivation, but the uninterrupted production line. Whoever dominated the time between the conception and delivery of a new weapon would dominate the battlefield. It no longer mattered who started the war with the most soldiers, but who ended it with the most units delivered. The future of the battles would be decided in the factories, not in the trenches. This turn did not go unnoticed by German observers. Although far from the Pacific theater, the Abwehr's reports on American campaigns began to report something unsettling, a doctrine of war that dispensed heroism. A German officer in a reserved analysis from 1945 wrote, "America does not fight with men, it fights with numbers that think." It was the recognition, however belated, that the Germanic operational logic, based on tactical elite, individual precision and steel courage, would be swallowed up by a tide of rational production and combined offensiveness. It was no longer a question of who shot better. It was about who could shoot more, for longer, in more places at the same time. Iwo Jima was therefore the funeral of the classical warrior, and the birth of the logistic combatant. Death is no longer honored. It is now measured in kilograms of explosive per square meter. The hero lost ground to the operator. The battle cry was replaced by the uniform roar of diesel engines, and fate began to be sealed by clipboards and formulas, not by swords held high. But the ultimate symbol of this transition, the clearest and most ironic of all, was the CBH-1, a weapon built by non-combatant soldiers, operated by field engineers, fueled by oil ships, and protected by tactics that prioritized the preservation of the machine over human life. A weapon that would not exist without prior planning, without tests, without revision of parts, without coordination of deliveries. A weapon that, for all that, won. In the next and final part of this account, we will examine what remains, not of the island but of the legacy, how Iwo Jima's flamethrower tanks shaped not only future battles, but the very way modern nations have come to view war, as an engineering problem rather than a moral dilemma. Because when heat overcomes courage, history changes axis, and with it, the destiny of civilizations changes. The defeat on Iwo Jima was not only territorial, it represented the complete collapse of a doctrine that believed that death could be organized, glorified, and offered as resistance. Japan erected an underground fortress based on honor, sacrifice, and tactical ingenuity, but he failed to imagine that the enemy would not attack with men, but with ideas coated with steel and fuel. The American victory was not won by isolated heroism, but by the ruthless sum of planning, logistics, and engineering. Every inch of the island was taken by an equation: range, pressure, armor, and when the last stronghold fell, it wasn't bravery that surrendered, it was the past. Modern warfare had arrived. The lesson of Iwo Jima is clear. Courage without ability is prolonged suicide. Bravery may stop a platoon, but it does not stop a continuous supply of industrial solutions. Flamethrower tanks don't spawn on the battlefield. They're created in offices, tested on runways, tuned by calm hands, and delivered by ships that cross oceans. Logistics do not support war. It is war. Victory belongs to the one who can turn imagination into production before the enemy turns courage into mourning. That's what the island proved, tunnel by tunnel. Decades later, General Heinz Guderian, architect of the German Blitzkrieg, would acknowledge in his memoirs, "We lost to trucks, to fuel, to spare parts. We lost out to mass production." This confession, coming from the military brain of an army that has turned movement into doctrine, sums up the historical irony that echoes from Iwo Jima to Berlin. If you value research and the search for historical truth, enjoy this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing to light the facts that have shaped the world. Comment below which was the most shocking data for you in the story. Was it the effectiveness of only 8 tanks? Or the surrender of soldiers trained to die? Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.